How do folks, David here with another video. Thanks very much for joining me. In this one I want to talk about inspiration. Now, why am I doing that? Well, to be perfectly honest, I need to get some content out, and all of the crafting that I have been doing over the course of this week realistically belongs in the Big Bot Bash video, so there isn't a great deal to actually be showing you. However, whenever I do a big build like this that takes an extended period of time, at some stage I always seem to kind of, well, almost lose the will to live, to be perfectly honest. And I've got to remind myself of why I'm doing it. Why did I start out on this? Why did I get into the hobby in the first place? Now, it doesn't matter whether or not it's figure painting, army collecting, role-playing games. There was something in all of our lives that got us into this hobby. You could have been walking down the high street, past a shop, saw all of those immaculate miniatures in the window, or even just the art on one of the boxes. You've gone in, checked it out, looked into it a little bit more, and decided suddenly you want to be a grey armoured space Viking. Or it could have been something like a TV programme. I know at the moment the big sort of upsurge in Dungeons and Dragons players has been due to its inclusion in the TV programme Stranger Things. Now, the original idea for this video realistically was just to do sort of like a top 10 of my favourite movies and TV programmes, because all YouTubers at some stage do sort of like top 10 things or ranking systems. But instead of that, I decided that I should probably keep it a little bit more on topic and have a look back and see what things like TV programs and movies sort of guided my journey within the hobby, which ones had sort of more of an impact than other ones. And of course, yes, they are going to be favourites because they had that big an effect on me. So without further ado, here's an insight into the kind of things that have guided my hobby journey. At number 10, and this one may seem a little bit of an oddball inclusion, but it is the Keanu Reeves movie The Replacements. Why is it in there? Well, if you think about it, they have assembled a team of complete misfits in a particular situation to carry out a particular mission, and through unorthodox methods they manage to achieve their goal. No pun intended. What have I taken from this? Well, if you think about it, it realistically sounds like any D&D party that meet in the pub for the first time. It is definitely one of those feel-good movies. It's one that I keep going back to time after time. If I need a little bit of pick-me-up, that is one of the ones that I will go back to. It is definitely a firm favourite in terms of movies, but that sort of unorthodox approach has definitely, and my ex-DMs and players will attest to this, that kind of thinking has definitely steered my play style over the course of the years. At number 9 is the TV series Sharp. This one hooked me as soon as I saw it, and for reasons I'll get into. The Napoleonic era has always kind of been at the back of my mind all the way through my hobby journey. Now, I stumbled across Sharp completely by accident. I was supposed to be meeting some of my mates for a drink down at the pub, and I was busy sort of like faffing about, getting ready, turned the TV on just to have a little bit of background noise going, and the opening refrain to the TV series came on. I stopped and had a look just for a couple of minutes, and 2 hours later there was the closing credits. Why has that been a big impact? Well, it reignited, and like I say, I'll get onto that later in the video, it reignited my interest in the Napoleonic era, and the whole premise of the story about this sort of small band of chosen men, soldiers, going through one of the most tumultuous periods in history, and how they dealt with it, and the kind of hardships that they had to face while coming out on top, was just absolutely brilliant. Again, some of their more unorthodox solutions to problems was brilliant. The idea of small unit tactics was a little bit of an eye-opener. Before that, it had been sort of like solo adventure or small party with D&D stuff, or large war games with complete armies, and having that sort of middle ground was a bit of an opener for me. One of the big takeaways that it did reinforce in terms of wargaming for me was the concept of making sure that you have a balanced force. In Napoleonic era, infantry, cavalry, artillery. You weren't going to win a battle unless you had all three, and that has certainly guided my army selection in not just purely going for elites. Actually having a balanced force has definitely been a big thing. At number 8, we have the Alien franchise. Now, probably the best one in my view out of the whole lot was Aliens, the second movie. And there's a whole lot to unpack from this one. So to start off, we've got the model making aspect. The first movie, Alien, all of their stuff was practical models. The Nostromo, a very sort of dirty bulk hauler, that was quite a stark departure from sort of like the clean lines of the Star Treks or other TV programs. It definitely added a very large element of realism in terms of model making. Go on to the second movie, and not only have you still got all of those practical effects and model making, again in a very sort of dark and dirty environment, but you've also got far more of the combat element. And it is two very separate forces. You've got the bad guys, the aliens, and they're really bestial and nasty. And you've got the ultra-confident Marines that basically get their bottoms kicked. When you also include a very strong female lead like Sigourney Weaver as Ripley, and the kind of things that she gets up to, I mean, she was badass. And it was certainly at a time where realistically you needed far more in terms of strong female characters on the screen rather than have them sit there, scream, and have to be rescued. All in all, an absolutely brilliant template for the more darker, dirtier aspects of wargaming that we now get in the likes of sort of like the grimdark future of 40k and things like that. At number 7, we have, appropriately enough, the British TV programme Blake 7. Now, this first came onto British TV screens when I was still a preteen. And for American viewers, if you've never watched this, yes, the special effects are definitely a little bit on the hokey side, as was low budget BBC sci-fi of the time. Yes, the sets wobbled, but it is definitely well worth the watch because it is far more character rather than action driven. Because they didn't have the budget for special effects and things like that, far more emphasis was put on the writing and the characters and the storyline as opposed to big flashy Disney type scenes. Why did this have an impact? Well, the heroes, if you want to call them that, realistically weren't very nice people themselves. It's just that the really bad guys, the totalitarian, it took me a couple of attempts to get that word out, the totalitarian federation who are in charge of everything, they are far, far worse. So yeah, it's a band of anti-heroes, and there are an awful lot of shades of grey. And when you start getting into things like role-playing games, it's very easy to fall into the stereotypical, I guess, lawful good, squeaky clean good guys and the chaotic, evil, nasty bad guys, and there's nothing in between. People kind of polarize to one or the other. You know, they want to be the hero or they want to be a complete bell end. Blake 7 and the characters within it gave that middle ground, that really grey area, that ambiguity of just how good were these guys. And I loved it. Coming in at number 6, we have the Terminator franchise. I know the later movies have got absolutely panned, but I just love it. Obviously, on my channel, there's a whole series of Terminator stuff. The fact that they brought it out as a board game is absolutely brilliant. When I saw it, had to buy it. Again, a little bit of an oddity in that the main protagonist throughout is a strong female character, but because I was of an age where computers were first starting to come into home use and the concept of robotics and artificial intelligence and things like that were being inserted into society, and you know, in cases of factories which starting to take over jobs, it was a fascinating take on how the over-reliance on these kind of machines could eventually lead to something really bad. And let's face it, the same is true of today, with people being put out of work with the advent of AI. But in purely game terms, having that concept of a completely implacable, unstoppable foe coming after you and having to do whatever you can to try and take it down is an absolutely brilliant concept. and brilliant in terms of gaming for ideas. I've certainly used that kind of thing in Dungeons and Dragons to throw a nasty little hook at the party. It's been ripped off by 40k in terms of the Necrons. What's not to love about nasty, unstoppable robots? Coming in at number 5, we have the works of Jerry Anderson. Now, we're talking in terms of when I was very small, the likes of Joe 90 and UFO and Thunderbirds and Captain Scarlet. Again, those models, absolutely brilliant model making. Yes, very clean. Certainly in terms of Space 1999, you would have maybe expected, thinking about it now, after having seen stuff like Aliens, a little bit more weathering on it, but the model making and the effects for the time were absolutely superb. And of course, because I was only sort of year high at the time, it's certainly something that has stuck with me. It was one of those sort of like formative images, and it's certainly the kind of benchmark that if you're doing model making, scratch building especially, it is the kind of level that you want to be aspiring towards. Coming in at number 4, we have the collected works of the special effects guru Ray Harryhausen, and it was all of that stop animation stuff. Yes, the effects nowadays do look extremely dated, but at the time, his work with stop animation and those huge monsters, creatures, and the way that they were integrated in with live action footage, it's the stuff of fantasy. Obviously, seeing stuff like that gives you far more of the theatre of the mind when it comes to playing D&D games. But this plasticine, the kind of stuff that he was actually making his stop animation figures out of, this was my toy of choice when I was a youngster, because you could make absolutely anything with it. And accordingly, I have absolutely no problem with attempting to sculpt something, just grab the modelling clay and get to it and go back to my childhood. The amount of time I spent with this stuff. Sorry, I've got plasticine in my hand, I can't stop playing with it. Anyway, let's move on. Now, before we get into the top 3, I want to go through some honourable mentions. Star Wars does not appear in the top 10 list, even though all of those practical effects, etc., are a big part of, I guess, the style of an awful lot of people's model making. Scratch builds like the Millennium Falcon, techniques that were used in making stuff like the X-Wings and the TIE Fighters, all of that kind of thing. Yes, it is, again, a level that should be aspired to when you're doing scratch builds or model making of any kind. The realism and the weathering, etc. But do bear in mind that I had already been introduced to that level of model making in the practical effects of the likes of Space 1999, as I've already mentioned. That is why Star Wars, unfortunately, gets booted out of the top 10. Another honourable mention goes to Flash Gordon. Now, my parents and older relatives, they had all gone to cinema matinees and been introduced to the likes of Flash Gordon and what was the other one? Buck Rogers. Very similar style. I absolutely love that sort of Art Deco integration in with models. I would love to do something like that myself. Haven't got round to it yet. But even though you could see the strings again for the time, and certainly because I was first introduced to seeing it, they had it on as serializations for the kids during school holidays and kept rerunning them. Again, it was one of those things that I was introduced to at a very early age, and the models were absolutely brilliant. Same kind of thing as Thunderbirds and Captain Scarlet, that kind of thing. Yeah, you could see the wires, but you kind of ignored that. Absolutely loved it. And again, when they did that 1980s remake, they kept all of that old aesthetic and added in a soundtrack by Queen. What's not to love? Now, before the advent of the movie 300 and all of its assorted blood and gore, there was an older movie, The 300 Spartans. It's a depiction of a famous battle. Yes, the movie adaptations do concentrate more on the Spartans and less on the Greeks that did actually help them out, because there was more than 300 in that whole sort of the whole Battle of Thermopylae and the various areas within it, but that whole concept of a small army taking on a far larger one, and through use of tactics and choke points, essentially that psychological effect that the big guys thought they were going to roll over them. It did not work out like that. They got very soundly beaten back, and to the point where even the best of their best did not want to engage, and they had to get finished off with massed archery fire. Those kind of things definitely can come across into your war games as, well, valid tactics if you can pull it off, if you can get into position. Again, I was introduced to that at a very, very early age, and it's a movie that's just kind of stuck with me. Maybe it should have been in the top 10, but there are so many that the list would have been absolutely endless, and somebody's got to lose out. The second last honourable mention, and again, if you've seen anything on the channel, you may be surprised that this one has not got into the top 10, Doctor Who. I've got the game, certainly had to have the miniatures for it, absolutely love the programme, but while yes, it is definitely a firm favourite, in terms of gaming and inspiration, there's not a huge amount to realistically take away from it. There wasn't absolutely marvellous set piece builds in terms of model. Yes, there was some reasonably good stuff. The ability to find a more peaceful solution, or one that doesn't include just mass force, has certainly coloured the way in which I approach role-playing games. I always keep that thing kind of at the back of my mind. But there are other things which were, I guess, of greater impact. Doctor Who, definitely a firm favourite in terms of what I would watch over and over, time after time, but in terms of its impact on my gaming, maybe not so much as the ones that actually made it into the top 10. And the very last honourable mention goes to MacGyver, the original series. I didn't like it when it first came out. It was only maturing in later years and being introduced to it essentially by the wife and things like Mythbusters that I went back and gave it a rewatch. And the concept of being able to use, well, essentially duct tape to fix absolutely anything, and some of the oddball solutions to problems and scratch builds and things like that, yes, they have had an impact. I can now look at different materials, find a use for them in scratch building, and certainly that concept of being able to sort of like jury rig a repair has held me in good stead in my professional career. There has certainly been more than one machine that I have MacGyvered during the course of my jobs. However, we won't go into that. So while I have to say that yes, it has certainly had an impact on my model making and my thought processes, etc., unfortunately, it did not make the top 10. It is time for the top 3. And in at number 3, if I didn't have Star Wars, Star Trek had to come in. That is where it is at. Now, I'm not talking about the more modern stuff, to be perfectly honest. There is that much of it out there that I cannot keep up and don't have the time to. And to be perfectly honest, it is missing the spark of the original. And it is the original. TOS, the original series, that is the one that I have taken my biggest inspiration from. Yes, the models were beautiful. Yes, the special effects don't necessarily hold out. Yes, it was produced before I was born and was a constant staple throughout my childhood and adulthood, and I will always watch reruns of it if it's on. But there are two main things that have had an impact on me. The first one, not necessarily in relation to the hobby, but it is Montgomery Scott. I got into my profession quite probably due to his influence in exactly the same way he did with so many other kids of the time. He was the one that got them into engineering. James Doohan, the actor, got big accolades for getting so many people into engineering because of his portrayal, and it was very, very well deserved. But the big impact that the characters of the original series had on my wargaming hobby was Captain Kirk and this particular quote.
I don't believe in the no-win scenario.
I don't believe in the no-win scenario. It doesn't matter how bad it looks in terms of your opposition on the gaming table. There is always a lucky dice roll. There is always a decision you can make. There is always some way of grasping victory from the jaws of defeat. It is probably one of the reasons why I am such a tenacious wargamer. I will not give up until my force is dead. There is always a way out. If there is one phrase that has an impact on my gaming career, that is it. At number 2, and anybody who knows me knew that this was going to be way up the top. In fact, a lot of people may wonder why it's not number 1.
In the end, there can be only one.
Highlander. You've got different time periods, you've got historical battles, you've got that mythicism, you've got very definite good guys and bad guys, you've got different character stereotypes, all of those kind of things that can go into D&D. Clancy Brown and his depiction of the Kurgan, you cannot get more chaotic evil than that. He is essentially the ultimate nasty bad guy. Add in sword fights, add in an older mentor figure, played by Sean Connery, absolutely brilliant, even though, well, it was just Sean Connery playing Sean Connery realistically, but what's not to love about that? An absolutely cracking soundtrack by Queen again, and you have the makings of an absolutely brilliant movie. And there's no real wonder why, out of all of the stuff from the Highlander franchise, it is that movie that keeps getting shown on repeat time after time after time. And yes, sitting on the pile of shame just over there is Highlander the board game with all the miniatures, and I really do have to get them painted up. Which brings us finally to the number 1 entry, and it's not a movie or a TV program or a set of books even, although I could probably do a complete other top 10 just on book series. The biggest inspiration for me in my hobby has come from people. You've possibly heard me talk before about Ian, who was the first person who introduced me to the concept of a 3-dimensional terrain in terms of Dungeons and Dragons. It was a big entry room in the underground complex in the Isle of Dread module, and he had taken some flat dungeon tiles and used blue tack and matchsticks to create a 2-level effect so that we could actually see that there was a balcony around there, and that just opened up a world. The rest in terms of builds is history, essentially stemming from that moment, even to the point where one of my first and biggest builds is my own proper recreation of that particular room. It's still on the shelf up there. In terms of proper DMing and the running of a game of Dungeons and Dragons, my hat goes off to Andy. He is probably one of the sharpest, most quick-witted people that I know, certainly when it comes to running games. He was an absolute nightmare to try and get anything over on as a DM. I learned so much from him. Andy, if you're watching this, for every nasty, horrible, evil trick that you have passed on to me, my players have a special hell marked out for you. And finally, probably the biggest influence when it has come to model making or wargaming has to go to my Uncle Peter. He was the one with all of the Airfix models. He was the one that would sit and paint, not using a brush, but with the old Humbrol enamel paints and a pin, and would sit there for hours on end doing Napoleonic Airfix 1/72 soldiers, and eventually ended up gifting me the whole box. I wish I had taken so much better care of them. And the biggest thing on my pile of shame is still over in the UK. It is the complete Hinchcliffe 25mm done back in lead, because we didn't have a concept of health and safety back then. The French Napoleonic army. Part of it is painted, most of it is still in the box. What I am going to do with it, I have absolutely no clue. One of the things I know that he always wanted to do, and he did actually make a start on, but never completed because he got a dog and the dog kept trying to eat the soldiers, was a diorama. He actually started on Custer's Last Stand. He never got round to finishing it. I have done my fair share of dioramas. You've seen me do those builds. Hopefully he's looking down and knows that the torch has been carried. There is, again, sitting waiting for me to eventually pluck up the courage to get around to it, an Airfix Waterloo diorama that I need to get done. I need to clear some space because it's going to be a biggie. So those are my top 10 and a few more inspirations, the kind of things that have guided my whole hobby journey, whether it's been painting, whether it's been modeling, whether or not it has been scenery. Now you have a little bit more of an insight into what has happened with me, and hopefully it gives you maybe a few ideas of your own, maybe some source material to go and check out, certainly in terms of maybe movies or TV programs that you haven't checked out before because you're a little bit younger than I am. Anyway, I should probably wrap this video up here. As ever, if you have any questions, please do drop them down in the comments below. Plus, let me know what your inspirations have been. Maybe there's something that I can check out and I can get ideas from. Hit like, subscribe, get notifications because there is going to be more coming. I am puffed out from all of this talking. I will see you good folk next time. Toodlepip for now.